especially for you, I would talk about how food shapes your behavior. And I mean very, very specifically how food shapes your behavior, not how the environment shapes your food choices, but how food might be having an effect on who you are and how you behave. So, what is your brain on food? I'm going to start, it's literally a whistle-stop tour, but we're going to go through the mechanics of hunger. We've all heard of it. Is it legit? And if it is, what's going on? Malnutrition and aggression, so really honing in on this special group of studies I call the prison studies. And then we're going to look at the relationship. This is a kind of very leading-edge research. It's very, very early on, but it's very, very interesting. Look at the relationship between food and our experience of fairness. Okay, so hunger. Broadly speaking, that feeling of irritability, anger, agitation, distress, unpleasantness that we get that is associated with hunger. Hunger being the physiological state of needing to eat. Is it legit? And actually, why is hunger so distressing is perhaps where we should start. So hunger is distressing essentially because you need to eat to live. Hunger is an evolved survival message, say, to motivate you. It's supposed to be uncomfortable, because if it wasn't uncomfortable, you wouldn't be motivated to get up, to move, to seek out food, and to consume food. So there is a reason that hunger is unpleasant, we don't like it, and we're motivated to do whatever we can to make it stop. But what about this relationship, this colloquial, everyday association we make between hunger and aggression? Is it legit? Is it a thing? So we think so. For a long time, it was just kind of something we would talk about between ourselves, but there seems to be growing evidence of this association. So first of all, we see an association between increased aggression and hunger in animal models, from flies to goats. When animals become hungry, they become more aggressive, they become bolder, they become a little bit more territorial and intense. And this gives you a little bit of an insight into the way psychologists work. So what they did was, there's a group of studies which really we wanted to test people's relationships, so we'll get into those in a moment. But first of all, we start out with 64 European adults. So it's a small study, but it's a kind of a test of whether this works in an ecological setting, in a real-world setting, asking people to give repeated measures at different time points of their hunger and their mood. And what they found was that hunger was responsible for about half the variance in your irritability. How hungry you were could answer the question as to how, about 50% of the variance into how irritable and moody and aggressive you would be. In a study of women, there was a higher association, and this was only done in published last year, a higher association of tension, anger, fatigue, confusion, poorer positive emotions when these women were hungry compared to when they were satiated. So we see these associations between the physiological state and the mood state. So what might be going on? So one of these issues is a concept called valence. I'm not sure, anybody familiar with valence? Okay. So valence is a psychological paradigm which speaks to your physiological state of pleasantness or unpleasantness, right? So hunger is a state of unpleasantness. A full belly is a pleasant state. Getting into bed after a really long, tiring day is pleasant. So it's a state of positive valence. And when we think about emotional states, what we're coming to understand is that emotion isn't just neck up. Emotion is a synthesis of the information coming from your body, how it's translated into your brain, and combined with the available emotional concepts. So the mood state that you are in is going to be influenced by the physiological state you are in. Now, some of that physiological state will be conscious to you. You will know if you're hungry. You'll know if there's a stone in your shoe. You'll know if your trousers are too tight, and that will start to affect your mood. But the vast majority of it is unconscious. You don't know the exact glucose level in your bloodstream. You're not sure exactly where or the effects of various nutritional components and what effect they might be having on your physiology. Your brain does. Your brain is making an interpretation, but you won't know that consciously. And we can map mood states across valence and arousal. So arousal you can think of as energy. How energetic am I feeling? And so high arousal but poor valence are feelings like anger. I've got a lot of energy, but I feel terrible, right? Whereas high arousal but high valence is excitement, feeling energetic, ready to go, happy, joyful. This combination of what's happening in your body, consciously and unconsciously, with your energetic state, your state of arousal, and your available emotion concepts will inform the emotional state that you enter into, what your brain tells you you are feeling. What else might be happening? Well, cortisol plays a role. And we think about cortisol as a stress hormone, and it is. But actually, one of cortisol's main jobs is regulation of blood glucose. The full name is it's a glucocorticoid, so there's a clue in the name. Because what happens when you're stressed, and stress is really, am I having to face a challenge or do I need to get out of the way? When you're facing that conflict, that decision, what needs to happen is your brain needs sugar. Glucose is the preferable mainstay fuel source for your brain. If you're having to make a decision, if you're having to think of an escape route, if you're having to think of the right words, if you're having to give a talk, your brain needs more glucose. And what will happen is that it will release cortisol to help release glucose from your bloodstream. And so that happens at the same time when you're hungry. Because when you're hungry, what will happen is that your cortisol will rise in order to release glucose from the liver to give you energy. So when you're hungry, you get this rise in cortisol, which gives your brain needed energy, but it also then comes along with this physiological experience of negative valence, of agitation, of difficulty, of unpleasantness, of restlessness, of listlessness. These are the mean studies that I was talking about. They got a group of long married couples, average of 12 years, and asked them to test their morning and evening cortisol levels for 3 weeks. And because psychologists are evil, then gave all the partners a voodoo doll of their partner. And they asked them, when you get angry with your partner, just stick a pin in the voodoo doll. And just tell us how many pins are in there. And they used the count of pins as a proxy for the amount of anger, and they found this correlation, this relationship between cortisol levels, as recorded in these across the 3 weeks, and the level of pins. And similarly, partners were more likely to blast their partner with a loud noise when they had higher levels of cortisol in their bloodstreams. Why is this relevant? And this, I have to put my hand up. At every opportunity, I want to make the social argument. This isn't just about individuals. We are responsible for each other. This is really important if any of you are in a position to think about food insecurity, hunger, and child hunger, because what we know is that a child doesn't necessarily have the emotional awareness or understanding or just the emotional regulation skills to understand that their hunger, that their irritability, their moodiness, the fact that they're kicking the table, elbowing the person they're sitting next to, is associated to their physiological state. It's up to adults to make that association and to advocate for the well-being of children. So I'll just take that moment to say that. But we know more broadly in terms of long-term mental health outcomes that independent of factors around socioeconomic, poor socioeconomic standing, poverty in general, living in a crowded home, not having your own bed, independent of those factors, hunger is associated with more anxiety, more irritability, more internalizing behaviors, and greater psychological risks down the line. So hunger is a source of toxic stress, and toxic stress is the kind of stress that you don't have the opportunity to recover from. You know, we're adapted to have peaks of stress after which we can rest and recover. Chronic hunger is a toxic stress that can lead to corrosion of mental health, and actually high cortisol for a long time is damaging to synapses, it's damaging to the structure of the brain. All right, let's move swiftly on to the prison studies. So I worked in prisons for a number of years. I ran a therapy service there. And while I was working, there were some studies that came out that were really actually very pertinent to the work that I was doing. Prisons are dangerous places. They are full of angry people. They are full of angry people who have drugs coming in a lot of the time. They are full of people, more broadly, who've experienced a lot of trauma and who haven't had the opportunity, the skills, the investment, the compassion to have to process that trauma. And often that trauma then is externalized in aggressive behavior. Prisons, the MOJ is constantly looking for ways to manage safety because safety is expensive, whether you're paying compensation to members of staff who have been harmed or assaulted, whether that's trying to recruit people to work in the prisons who have left because morale is so low. It's very expensive. Aggression and violence in prison is very, very expensive, and it's a big problem for the MOJ. So this group of studies is really interesting. They reach back to 1997 and most recently 2020, and they are all at least double-blind randomized trials. One is triple-blinded. And basically, blinding is really the level of awareness of the people participating, that what they're getting is the active treatment. So the participant is blind if they don't know whether they're getting the actual supplement or a placebo. The practitioner is blind, and that would be double-blinded, if I don't know whether I'm giving them the active substance or the placebo. So what the blinding allows us to have a bit more rigor in not biasing the outcomes and being a bit more certain, or a bit more confident at least, that the intervention is responsible for the outcome. And these are really important outcomes. So they've looked at 62, 200, around 200 on average, violent male offenders. And they've given them, randomized them into two groups. Let's say this side of the room, you're all violent offenders. This side of the room, you don't know it, but you're all getting vitamins. This side of the room, you don't know it, but you're all getting a placebo, just a sugar pill. It does nothing. After 2 weeks, 12 weeks, you guys, having been terribly violent for a long time, are now 30% less likely to get involved in an act of aggression. And that is objective incidents of violence. So what they do in prison is you have a logbook at the end of the wing, and you can count the number of violent incursions that have happened on that wing. And simply through the intervention of nutrition, and the prison population is a group with very, very poor nutrition, both in the prison but also historically, simply by improving nutritional status, we get a 30% reduction in objective incidents of violence. So when we're talking about a cheap, accessible, low-risk intervention for something like violence, and the thing about violence is we tend to think of it as a volitional act, right? And certainly our judicial system thinks of it as a volitional act. You decide to punch someone in the face. You decide whether you're going to walk away. We have a judicial system that is based on volition, and the idea being that you have the knowledge and you have the moral awareness to make a decision about what you're going to do. You know right from wrong, and if you do wrong, then it's because you've decided to do wrong. But what that premise says, or what it assumes, is that the machinery that is doing the decision-making is working properly, right? The fundamental assumption is that the machinery, the brain, that is making that decision is working properly. And I think what this group of studies does is to really question that basic premise. If someone is really, really nutritionally depleted, is the machinery of decision-making really working as well as we would like it to be? And it raises quite difficult questions, very messy questions, about what we mean when we say volition, decision-making, and choice. Speaking of which, this is really lovely, but it's a very early study, so don't go home and change your diet based on this study. It's just a very interesting look into what might be happening. And what I love about it is really this. It moves us away from this dichotomy, this dualism we have, that decision-making is neck up and the body is just surplus to requirements. Of course, the body doesn't work that way. Your brain is fed by everything that you eat. It is affected by your immune system, your microbiome, your stress levels, the hormones you're cycling through at whatever time of the month. Your brain is affected by all of these things. And so we need to start opening our our thinking, and certainly our research, to the idea that what happens in the body might be affecting what happens in the brain. So in this study, participants, again, were split into two groups. So the violent guys, we're going to give you a high-protein breakfast. And you guys, you're going to get a high-carb breakfast. And then we're going to play a game. And this game is essentially a game of fairness. So what will happen in this game is that, let's say, you and I are playing a game. And the researcher gives you £10 and says you can decide how to split it with me. You can split it any way you like, absolutely any way you like. You can keep 9, I get 1, that's fine. I can choose to accept that offer or reject it. If I reject it, neither of us get anything, right? So it's really a test of fairness, my willingness to accept an unfair offer, yeah? Because really the most logical thing to do would be to split 50-50, and that's the most fair thing, and we both go away with something. We walked in without any money at all, so now we've each got a £5. But that's not necessarily how humans work. So we have a look. So I can choose to punish you by rejecting the offer. We both go home with nothing. What they found was that there was a difference in the tendency to accept or reject the unfair offer dependent on the type of breakfast the person had had. So player B, if they'd had a high-protein breakfast, so I'm player B, they were much more willing to accept the unfair offer. Much more willing to say, OK, I'll just take the £1 then, better than nothing, than if I'd had the high-carb breakfast. We've got 45 seconds left, so we can certainly talk about the hypotheses, the ideas about what might be happening behind that. So high-carbohydrate breakfasts seem to increase the availability of serotonin in the brain, of tryptophan, which is a precursor to serotonin. High protein increases the availability of tyrosine, which is a precursor to dopamine. And it may be, and this is still a working hypothesis, it may be that the difference in the availability of those amino acids and then the neurotransmitters that they go on to make makes a difference to your sensitivity to unfairness in the real world. And where that's an interesting question is, one, our general food system, which tends to be pretty high in sugar, very high in carbohydrates. What does that mean? But also, on a smaller level, lots of people moving to these high-protein, carnivore, keto-type diets where there's a high availability of protein. Is that shifting the kinds of decisions they're making in the world? Is an ongoing question. So a very, very quick whistle-stop tour. The summary: our brains are made of food, and the quality of nutrition has a profound effect on its structure and its function. Not just what it looks like, but how well it works. The nutritional status of our brains, and I call them brain bodies because I try to get away from this kind of separation. They are one thing, you are one organism. It's constantly and unconsciously being influencing our moods, decisions, and behaviors. And the nature and quality of the food environment may be shaping our society at large in ways that we haven't even thought about. So that is me. Thank you very much. And I'm taking questions.
All around the city and from coast to coast. I'm slick.
That was absolutely sensational. I've always been a big fan of Edward de Bono, who died, I think, last year. But when, at one point, Edward de Bono recommended that the problems of the Middle East could be solved by giving them Marmite, I thought he completely jumped the shark. Okay, I have to admit. But there is some sort of vitamin deficiency which I think comes with eating unleavened bread. Is that right?
So the data around Marmite is really interesting, and that looks, essentially, Marmite is a foodstuff that is naturally high in B vitamins. And when they're looking at studies and correlations of the association between stress resilience and diet, what they use as the best intervention to test it against is Barocca. So we know there is good evidence, and I'm not funded by Barocca, okay. But we know that there is evidence that increased availability of B vitamins increases stress resilience. And so Marmite has been associated in some studies with increased stress resilience and reduced severity of anxiety.
So this is genuinely extraordinary because, I only started to discover this, and I discovered this whole field, by the way, almost accidentally, because a group of neuroendocrinologists from the University of Cork, who you've probably come across.
Oh, yes, Dr.
You know them.
Cryan.
Yeah, Dr. Cryan got in touch with me discussing fecal transfer or fecal transplants, where if you actually effectively replace someone's biome, I suppose it's the microfauna
They
within
call
their
them
gut.
crapsules.
Crapsules, exactly. Now, he didn't want me to undergo this, but he did actually want me to rebrand fecal transplants, which I think makes sense, because it can't really be any worse, can it? But what's so interesting is that effectively the part of there's almost what they refer to as a second brain, which is the part of the brain that actually encompasses the digestive system. And that's the whole neuroendocrine system, which takes up an extraordinary part of brain energy and processing, and yet, of course, all operates pretty much below the level of consciousness.
Absolutely.
So this is absolutely fascinating. Okay, you've got to tell them a bit about fecal transplant, because I've teased them with that concept. But it seems that you can actually take on the elements almost of the personality.
It's really extraordinary work, and they've used it. So fecal transplants essentially are taking and they literally take a stool sample from someone who is healthy, and you've really got to, your family history has to be pretty stringent, no history of things like MS or diabetes or kind of those sorts of things. They take a stool sample and they clean it up, and then they kind of repopulate the bacterial composition there, and they put it into a capsule. And then for people, particularly who have C. diff infection, which is a very kind of dangerous gut infection, they found that this transplantation, either from the bottom or from the top, can improve survival rates of C. diff, but certainly in animal studies what's been seen is shifts in what we might call the animal equivalents of depression and anxiety. And I think that's how John got into the research area, was that he was working on stress, and he was starting to see this relationship between the gut microbiome and stress outcomes. And really that there seems to be this way in which what happens in the gut can actually shape the morphology of the brain in utero and in early development. So what's happening in the gut is somehow being translated into the brain and shifting the way that it develops.
That's absolutely freaky. Good, I've got to ask, because otherwise the people watching online won't get jealous of you in the hall. Any questions directly? Anybody want to stand up and ask a question? How many minutes have we got? Just quickly.
One.
No,
okay. None minutes.
So, I mean, this question in terms of, for example, violence and prison diet. Now, my colleague Chris Graves was saying the problem with doing that in America was people would claim it was mind manipulation. I don't really see how you'd see that. That seems to be taking an extremely strong opinion. But why? My suspicion is that actually Edward de Bono probably read the earliest of the 4 studies, which is where his conclusions came from. Why is that? Those are extraordinarily high figures, by the way, in a double-blind trial.
Absolutely.
Why is it that this is practiced so little and so little known?
This is my perennial question. This is what fills me with constant rage. You know when the Hulk says, "I'm always angry"? This is me, like in a constant state of rage, because it's just extraordinary, especially when you've worked in the prison system and you've seen the level of harm. And I'm not saying it's a magic bullet and it's going to fix everything, but we have the opportunity to intervene in a way that is low cost, it's really accessible, and it's low risk. There are, with other interventions, medications, you have risks of things like tardive dyskinesia and people becoming very sleepy, people having very flattened affect, they feel bad. That doesn't happen when you're giving people nutrients. So it might not fix everything, but it might help, and there aren't really any side effects. It is an extraordinary, I think, dereliction of duty that the MOJ, that part funded the second study, the 2002 study, has done absolutely nothing on this.
So hold on, they funded the study, they got those results. The cost of the intervention is absolutely minuscule, so effectively the return on investment would be colossal. Enormous. And yet nothing has happened. Okay. That's the big behavioural question, actually, at the end of this day, which is how on earth you can discover something so profound and actually do nothing with it. And we often have this worry, which is that actually people in certain government positions want the solution to be commensurately expensive
Yes.
with the problem.
Or even just novel. And sorry, it was the Home Office, not the MOJ, so I should correct that. They want it, you know, it's not a magic drug, it's not a new patentable drug, it's nothing, it's food, it's nutrients. And I think that's part of the issue, is that it's so ubiquitous and it feels so every day that we don't really believe that it could be having this profound an effect. And also, I think, particularly with the prison population, there isn't much sympathy for prisoners. If we were talking about children, if we were talking about the elderly, if we were talking about pregnant mothers, and I talk a lot about them as well, I think there's much more sympathy. But I think that you don't garner much sympathy, particularly in an election cycle, by saying, let's be nice to criminals.
No, interesting. That's fantastic. Well, thank you. That was absolutely sensational.
Thank
I'm
you.
still aghast. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Absolutely wonderful.